He sat on the floor and wept. Not because of death, or war, or loss, but because no one believed him. Sheets of paper lay scattered around his feet, corners curling in the damp air of a London basement. Pencil marks, circles, and numbers, all of it meaningless, apparently, to everyone except the man kneeling among them. Barnes Wallis. Engineer. 45 years old. A man whose entire life had been spent in the service of logic, of equations that always added up. But now, in 1942, he was asking the impossible. He wanted to build a bomb that could bounce. Upstairs, the air raid sirens had fallen silent. Smoke still hung above the city from the last Luftwaffe raid, a faint, oily haze that turned daylight to pewter. Wallis barely noticed. He was drawing again, the sound of his pencil scratching against the drafting board like a heartbeat. Across the paper, a perfect sphere. Around it, arrows and waves, sketches of water splashing like ripples in a pond. A note scrawled beside it, backspin, counterclockwise, maintain surface contact. The door opened behind him. His assistant, young and tired, held out a telegram. From the ministry, he said. Wallis didn't even look up. They've refused again, haven't they? A pause. Then quietly, they laughed, sir. Of course they did. The generals in their polished offices had chuckled when he presented the idea. You mean to tell us, Mr. Wallis, that your weapon will skip across water like a child's toy ball? Wallis had met their laughter with a thin smile. Exactly that, gentlemen. And it will break their dams. They hadn't understood. They couldn't. But the figures in his notebook told a story too perfect to ignore. The Ruhr Valley, the beating industrial heart of Germany, lived on water. Its factories, steel mills, and power plants drew life from three great dams, Möhne, Eder, and Sorp. Destroy those, and the entire network would drown. Traditional bombs couldn't do it. The concrete was too thick, the flak too heavy. But water, Wallis thought, could be the key. That night, in the basement of the Vickers Armstrong factory, he built a model, a small wooden trough, a steel sphere no bigger than an orange, a hand-cranked launcher. He turned the handle slowly, released, and watched the ball skip across the surface, 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and strike the miniature dam at the far end. The tiny wall cracked in half. For a second, he just stared. Then a sound escaped him, not a cheer, not quite laughter, but something between relief and disbelief. It worked. The next morning, he carried his soaked blueprints back to the Ministry of Aircraft Production. He didn't ask permission. He demanded attention. You laughed once, he told them. Do it again after this. He set the model on the table, wound the handle, and launched the sphere across a tin trough filled with water. It bounced, 1, 2, 3, and shattered the little barrier at the end. No one laughed this time. Still, silence wasn't victory. They questioned feasibility, accuracy, cost, risk. 1,000 reasons to delay. Wallis pressed harder, voice trembling with both exhaustion and conviction. Gentlemen, the war will not be won by playing safe. Every day our bombers drop thousands of tons of high explosive on the Ruhr, and the lights stay on. Give me one weapon, one chance, and I'll turn their rivers against them. When the meeting ended, no one shook his hand. But 2 weeks later, a sealed order arrived at his workshop, Project Upkeep, approved for prototype testing. He stared at the signature at the bottom, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, and felt a chill. Harris was not a man who gambled. Spring brought the first field tests. A modified Wellington bomber roared low over Chesil Beach, releasing a spherical casing that skipped across the water before sinking and detonating with a muffled, thunderous boom. The wave it threw was enormous. It worked. Not perfectly, but enough. In his private journal that night, Wallis wrote, I am not a dreamer. I am an engineer. But even an engineer can pray. The success came with a catch. The bomb could only work if dropped with absolute precision, from exactly 60 feet above the water, at precisely 220 miles per hour, from the perfect distance and angle. In daylight, impossible. In darkness, suicidal. The ministry's message was brief: proceed to next phase. Form specialized unit capable of operational deployment. Target, the dams of the Ruhr. Wallace read it twice. He imagined the pilots who would have to do it, men flying heavy Lancasters at treetop height over enemy territory, in the dead of night, with no margin for error. He looked down at his design again, at the sphere that had once bounced across a toy pond. It no longer looked like a weapon or an idea. It looked like a burden. But the logic remained flawless. And the war, as always, did not wait. 6 months later, he received the news: a new unit had been formed under a young wing commander named Guy Gibson. Their mission, to fly at night, 18 meters above the water, and drop the unthinkable. Wallace folded the letter and placed it on his desk. The rain outside had turned steady, tapping against the window like a clock counting down. He whispered to no one, "Then God help them. Because physics will not." Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. You weren't chosen because you're the best, the voice said. You were chosen because you're mad enough to try. The men laughed, but it wasn't the laughter of confidence, more the nervous kind that filled the air before something too big to understand. The hangar at RAF Scampton smelled of oil, coffee, and cold metal. The rain outside drummed steadily on the roof, like distant engines. At the front of the formation stood Wing Commander Guy Gibson, 24 years old, already decorated twice, the youngest man in the room and somehow the oldest. He looked at the faces lined up before him: pilots, gunners, engineers, all drawn from different squadrons, each wondering why they'd been pulled into this mystery unit with no name, no crest, no history. Behind him, a blackboard bore a number scrawled in chalk: 617. "This squadron doesn't exist yet," Gibson said. "But when it does, it will be remembered, or forgotten completely. Depends on whether we pull this off." No one asked what this was. Not yet. The next weeks were a blur of impossible training. Flying at night, skimming treetops and rivers at speeds that made your eyes water. Their aircraft, Avro Lancasters, were stripped of armor, refitted with a strange cylindrical load slung beneath the belly. Mechanics whispered rumors about Wallace's toy ball and the bouncing bomb. On the first low-altitude exercise, Pilot Officer Hopgood clipped a hedgerow and came back with grass jammed into the undercarriage. "You call that flying?" Gibson barked. Hopgood grinned. "You said 50 feet, sir. I gave you 49. The laughter broke the tension for a moment. But by the 5th run, nobody was joking. The altimeter needle shivered constantly. A single mistake meant a smear of metal across the water. The crews learned new tricks: how to judge height not by instruments, but by instinct. 2 spotlights were fixed to the underside of each Lancaster. When their beams converged into a single circle on the surface of the water, they knew they were exactly 60 feet above it. "Keep the lights kissing," the instructor said. "If they separate, you die." Every evening, they practiced over Derwent Reservoir, flying so low that fishermen on the shore could feel the wind from the propellers. Villagers complained about broken windows. The RAF apologized and kept flying. By April, the squadron had a name: the Dambusters, though it was never written on any official document. They were still ghosts. One night in the mess hall, Gibson called his flight leaders together. The room was dim, the air thick with smoke and fatigue. He spread a map across the table, 3 red circles marked in pencil. "These," he said simply, "are our targets." The room fell silent. "Moan, Eder, Sorp," Gibson continued. "The dams that feed the Ruhr. Our job is to breach them. If we succeed, half of Germany's industry drowns." Someone exhaled slowly. Another muttered, "Jesus." Gibson looked at them one by one. "We'll fly in 3 waves. Night of May 16, altitude 60 feet. Over enemy territory. No lights. No escort. If we're lucky, half of us come back. No one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the radio in the corner. Then flight engineer Dave Maltby broke the silence. "So, we'll make history or vanish trying." "Exactly," Gibson said. Dismissed. Outside, the wind carried the smell of spring and engine fuel. In the hangars, the modified bombs were being fitted, massive steel cylinders spinning slowly on testing rigs, their rotation reversed against the direction of flight. Barnes Wallis himself watched, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. 18 meters, he murmured to the ground crew. Not 17. Not 19. 18. He knew what that meant. The pilots had to hold an altitude lower than a church steeple, at full speed, while aiming at a wall of concrete defended by flak and searchlights. In the following days, tension wrapped around the base like fog. Letters home were shorter, jokes quieter. Some painted small charms on their planes, a lucky card, a girl's name, a black cat. The superstitions grew as the date drew near. On May 14, Gibson received the final briefing from Bomber Command, Operation Chastise, confirmed. Target time, 0:15 hours, May 17. That night, he walked the length of the runway alone. He could hear the mechanics tuning the engines, smell the damp grass, feel the weight of what was coming. Above him, the moon hid behind a thin veil of cloud, half visible, half gone, like the line between courage and insanity. In another hangar, Barnes Wallis sat by the radio, tracing his finger over the blueprint of his creation. The bomb was ready. The men were ready. The war, as always, was impatient. A storm was forming over the North Sea, but the order would not change. At dawn, the message went out, Operation Chastise, launch in 48 hours. In the squadron hut, Gibson gathered his men for the final briefing. "You've trained for 8 weeks, he said. You know what to do. Don't think about medals. Don't think about odds. Just fly the plan." A young gunner raised his hand. "Sir, what if we miss?" Gibson's eyes were steady. "Then we go around again." No one asked another question. Outside, the sky was clearing. A pale sliver of moon hung over the horizon, the same moon that would light their path 2 nights later. Somewhere far away, behind that horizon, the dams of the Ruhr waited, silent, massive, and unbreakable. For now. The night smelled of rain and fuel. Engines trembled on the tarmac like restless animals, their propellers slicing the mist into silver ribbons. Mechanics moved between the Lancasters with flashlights, hands black with grease, faces pale with the knowledge that some of these aircraft would never return. At 9:28 p.m. Wing Commander Guy Gibson climbed into his cockpit. The metal steps were slick with dew. He glanced once at the ground crewmen saluting below and said quietly, "See you at breakfast." It wasn't a promise. It was a ritual. 19 bombers lined the runway, each carrying a single, gleaming cylinder beneath its belly, spinning counterclockwise at 500 revolutions per minute. The invention that had consumed Barnes Wallis for a year now sat humming like a clock that couldn't be stopped. Far from Scampton, in a small control room, Wallis listened to the static of the radio, fingers tapping against the table. Every few seconds he glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. Gibson's voice broke through the hiss of the intercom, "Squadron 617, you are cleared for departure." One by one, the Lancasters rolled into the dark, massive shapes sliding down the runway until the wheels lifted, shadows rising into shadows. The ground disappeared beneath them, replaced by cloud and the glint of moonlight on water. Their route wound across the North Sea, then inland over Holland. Altitude, 60 feet. Speed, 220 miles per hour. So low that the waves seemed close enough to touch. Inside the cockpit, the crew moved with mechanical precision, navigator, engineer, gunner, all in rhythm. The altimeter needles shook violently, Gibson trusted the twin spotlights on the fuselage instead. When the two white beams merged into one circle on the surface below, they were exactly 18 meters above the water. Any higher, the bomb would bounce wrong. Any lower, they'd never bounce again. At 10:15, the first shock came. The lead element, flown by Flight Lieutenant Shannon, clipped a power line. Sparks exploded across the sky. The radio filled with static, a sharp cry, then silence. Gibson's jaw tightened. "Keep formation," he ordered. "We continue." Through the darkness, tracer fire arced upward from the German coast, thin red lines searching for invisible wings. One Lancaster vanished in a flash of orange. Another limped west, engine trailing smoke. Still, they pressed on. Danner, the bomb aimer in Gibson's crew, spoke through clenched teeth, "We're flying through hell." "Not yet," Gibson replied. "That's still ahead." By midnight, the first target loomed on the radar scopes, the Moon Dam, hidden beneath layers of mist. Gibson's crew couldn't see it, only the faint shimmer of moonlight reflected off the reservoir. He ordered the formation to hold orbit, waiting for a gap in the cloud. Inside the cockpit, the air was unbearably still. The crew could hear each other breathing through their oxygen masks. Then, as if in answer, the mist thinned. Below them stretched a black ribbon of water, the great concrete wall curving across it like a scar. "Target visual," the navigator whispered. "Attack run," Gibson said. The first Lancaster dove to 60 feet, bomb spinning, lights locked on the dam. The voice over the radio was steady, 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 now. The release button clicked. The bomb dropped, skipped once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times, each bounce throwing up a plume of silver spray, before striking the wall and vanishing beneath the surface. 30 seconds of silence. Then the lake exploded upward. The shockwave rocked Gibson's plane, the blast lighting the cockpit with blinding white. Through the smoke, they saw water surging over the dam's crest. "She's cracked," shouted the rear gunner. Gibson's knuckles whitened on the control column. "Go again," he ordered. "Finish it." Another Lancaster came in low, flak bursting around it. A hit, the bomb veered off course and vanished into the valley. Then the third aircraft made its run, engines screaming, tracer fire slicing through the night. This time the explosion was different, deeper, heavier. The wall shuddered, split, and gave way. A roar rose from the valley like a living thing. Water, millions of tons, burst through, tearing down everything in its path. From the air it looked unreal, like a wound opening in the earth. "Target destroyed," Gibson said quietly. His voice trembled not with triumph, but with disbelief. Over the radio, a cheer went up from one of the crews. Then silence again. The dam was gone, but the night wasn't over. 2 more targets remained. And the Eder Valley, surrounded by mountains and fog, waited ahead like a trap designed by the gods themselves. Barnes Wallace, still in his control room, pressed his palms together, staring at the blank radio dial. "Please," he whispered. "Just bring them home." But the static only grew louder. No one was meant to go farther that night. But Gibson said, "We're going." The silence that followed was heavier than the drone of engines. Then, throttles forward, the sound rising, the propellers cutting into fog like blades through cloth. The Eder Valley was a labyrinth of mountains and mist, the kind of place no one should fly through, especially not at night, especially not at 60 feet. But the order was clear. The Moon Dam was gone, breached and drowning half the Ruhr, yet the second target still stood. "Altitude, 60, Gibson called. His co-pilot's hands were slick on the controls. Below them, the river twisted like a serpent, disappearing and reappearing between clouds. The Eder Dam was unlike Moon. No flat approach, no steady line. The surrounding hills forced them into a blind turn, down through the valley, across the water, then up and over a ridge before the bombing run. Even in daylight it would have been madness. In the moonlight haze, it was suicide painted silver. The first Lancaster descended into the valley, wings brushing the edges of vapor. The crew barely breathed. "Watch the trees," someone said. "They're higher than they look." They made one pass. Too steep. Another. Too short. Gibson's voice came over the radio, "Hold it together, boys. One more time." The pilot, young and pale under the glow of the dials, took the aircraft down again, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The bomb aimer stared through the sight, nothing but black water ahead. "Hold, steady, steady, now." The release lever clicked. The bomb dropped, spinning, skipping once, twice, then vanishing into darkness. The men counted aloud. 28, 29, 30. The valley erupted. A column of water shot skyward, black against the starlight, followed by a roar that swallowed every other sound. For a second, no one spoke. Then the rear gunner whispered, "Jesus, she's gone." The Eder Dam cracked down the middle, a wound opening from within. The reservoir, 200 million tons of trapped water, surged forward, devouring the valley below. The pilots pulled hard on the yoke, climbing through the shockwave. From above, they saw it, the flood spilling through the gap, white under the moon, racing down toward the sleeping towns. "We're done here," Gibson said softly. "Let's get home." But below them, the valley was only beginning to wake. In the small villages beneath the dam, windows rattled, dogs howled, and people stepped out into the chill night air, confused by the low, growing rumble. Then they saw it, a wall of water, taller than any building, glowing faintly in the moonlight as it rolled toward them. Some tried to run. Some simply froze. The sound came first, a low thunder, like the heartbeat of the earth. Then came the wind, then the water. A farmer in Hemfirth later told investigators, "We woke to a sound that wasn't a sound. It was everything moving at once." The flood smashed through the valley, houses, bridges, roads, all gone in minutes. In Castle, 20 miles downstream, the riverbanks disappeared entirely. Whole neighborhoods were swept into the current. From the air, Gibson's crews could see the destruction stretching for miles, lights snuffed out, roads erased. It was both magnificent and terrible. One of the bomb aimers wrote later, "It was beautiful in the way lightning is beautiful, brief, violent, merciless." Back in his office, far from the battle, Barnes Wallace sat alone by the radio, listening to the intermittent bursts of static that marked the returning squadrons. When the coded message finally came, "Gone or two breached," he lowered his head into his hands. He should have felt triumph. Instead, all he felt was the weight of water. The Eder Dam had stood for generations. Now, in less than a minute, it was gone, and the valley it had guarded was drowning beneath its own creation. "God forgive me," Wallace whispered. Above Germany, the surviving Lancasters turned west, engines straining, fuel low, hearts hammering. No one spoke. They had seen too much. In the distance, the fires of the Ruhr flickered through the haze. The pilots knew that by morning, the world would know what had happened, that the heart of Germany had been struck not by flame, but by flood. They also knew that half their number was missing. As they crossed back over Holland, the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, a faint gray shimmer on the water. It was almost beautiful. But behind them, the Eder Valley was still screaming. And in the Ruhr, the water kept coming, rolling, roaring, breaking every line it met. At Scampton, the radio operators were waiting, ears pressed to the static, counting the call signs as they returned: N for Nancy, P for Peter, J for Johnny. There were fewer than there should have been. The first reports came before sunrise. A German radio operator in Essen broke through the static, his voice trembling. Catastrophe in the Ruhr, dams destroyed, flooding widespread. At first, no one in Berlin believed it. How could a few aircraft, a single night, undo what thousands of engineers had built over decades? But as dawn crept across the valley, disbelief gave way to horror. The Ruhr, once the humming engine of the Reich, lay drowned. From the air, reconnaissance photographs showed a wound carved through the land, roads swallowed, bridges snapped like matchsticks, and fields turned to black mirrors. Smoke rose from drowned factories where boilers had burst under the surge. Railway lines vanished into lakes that hadn't existed the night before. In the town of Neum, the church bell rang once before being carried away by the current. Witnesses later said the water came, like a wall, 10 meters high, glowing silver under the moon. Entire families were swept from their homes. Cows, wagons, timber, all merged into the torrent. The Eder and Möhne floods merged as they traveled north, joining the Ruhr River near Hagen, turning the industrial basin into a sea. By mid-morning, the radio broadcasts had shifted from confusion to command: evacuate the valleys. Do not approach the water. But it was too late. In Ham, hundreds climbed to rooftops and grain silos, waving lamps into the mist, waiting for rescue that never came. Power stations went dark. Telephone lines fell silent. The pulse of German industry, steel, coal, ammunition, was gone, replaced by the slow thunder of water moving where it had no right to be. Inside the Air Ministry in Berlin, officers gathered around maps marked with red ink. Each red zone was a loss. Together, they looked like an open wound on the body of the Reich. General der Flieger Erhard Milch spoke first. How long to restore power? An engineer answered, voice thin. Weeks. Maybe more. The silence that followed was heavier than the flood itself. Meanwhile, in Essen, a young woman named Lotte Bergmann wrote in her diary. We woke to a sound that was not thunder. The ground shook. My father shouted that the river was coming. When we opened the door, the river was already inside. She would never write again. The diary was later found miles away, wedged in the branches of a dead tree. For the Allied commanders, the mission was a success beyond measure: 2 dams breached, over 100 factories temporarily out of operation, 40% of the region's electricity gone. But even in victory, unease settled in. Back in England, as reports came in, one RAF officer said quietly, we thought we'd broken concrete. We broke a river. In London, the War Office listened to intercepted German transmissions describing chaos: bridges gone, railways submerged, communications cut. On the surface, it was triumph. But when the casualty numbers arrived, the mood shifted. Over 1,300 dead. Many of them civilians. A note from Barnes Wallace survives in the archives. His handwriting shakes. I wanted to stop the war, not create another disaster. I never imagined so many would die beneath my equation. That morning, the newspapers celebrated. Dams smashed, Ruhr in chaos, the headlines roared. The public cheered. The men who had flown the mission read the headlines in silence. In the Ruhr itself, German engineers worked day and night to contain the destruction. By the second evening, makeshift bridges spanned the smaller rivers. Pumps labored to drain factory basements. The sound of hammers and engines began to rise again, faint but relentless. War does not pause for grief. At dusk, the floodwaters reflected the fires of the furnaces still burning beyond reach of the damage. From a hill near Menden, a German officer looked down and whispered, even drowned, the Ruhr breathes. And still, the water kept moving, carrying debris, corpses, and memories downstream toward the Rhine. In England, the 617 Squadron's radio room at Scampton buzzed with static. Operators leaned over the sets, counting return call signs. N for Nancy. P for Peter. J for Johnny. They stopped. There were fewer than there should have been. Some of the missing were still in the air. Some were gone forever, vanished into the same darkness they had flown through. At the far end of the runway, Guy Gibson waited. His flight jacket was soaked with dew, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon. The first pink light of dawn bled through the mist. He knew the mission had succeeded. But he also knew the cost, though he didn't yet know its size. A mechanic approached quietly. Sir, they're saying both dams are confirmed. You did it. Gibson didn't answer. He was listening, for engines that never came. Miles away, the floodwaters of the Ruhr still whispered through broken streets, carrying the echoes of the night before, the hum of bombers, the crash of water, the voices lost in between. And in Scampton, the radio operator lifted his headset once more, repeating the same call sign into the static. No reply. The engines began returning just after dawn. Low shapes in the mist, broken wings glinting under the pale sun. The ground crews at Scampton stood in silence as each Lancaster touched down, its wheels screaming against the wet runway. 8 aircraft. Out of 19. Guy Gibson watched from the tarmac, hands clenched in his gloves. The air still smelled of oil and burned fuel. One by one, the bombers taxied to a stop, their engines coughing into silence. The men climbed down slowly, eyes hollow, faces streaked with smoke and sweat. No one cheered. The last to land came in crooked, a gash through its wing, holes torn through the fuselage. Mechanics ran to meet it. The rear gunner didn't move. When they opened the turret, blood dripped onto the concrete. Gibson didn't flinch. He simply nodded to the medics. Get him out. Inside the control tower, the radio crackled with static. Operators still called into the ether, naming planes that would never answer. D for dog. G for George, nothing. Silence, then the faint hum of feedback. Barnes Wallace sat in his office at Vickers, staring at a teletype printout. It was brief, clinical, operation successful. 2 dams breached. Heavy losses. He read the words again, slower this time. Then he set the paper down and pressed his hands over his face. God help me, he whispered. I never wanted them to die for my numbers. At the base, Gibson filed his mission report in a single sentence. Task completed. Objective achieved. No mention of names. No mention of absence. When reporters arrived that afternoon, the men stood stiffly in formation, eyes fixed forward. Cameras clicked, journalists shouted questions. Was it worth it? How does it feel to make history? No one answered. That night, the officers' mess was quiet. Normally there'd be noise, laughter, music, the reckless joy of survival. Now only the sound of rain against the windows. Gibson sat apart from the others, a glass untouched beside him. He kept staring at the empty chairs. Flight engineer Dave Maltby raised his head. We did it, Skipper. You should be proud. Gibson looked at him and said, I'm proud. But I'd trade every medal they'll give us for one more plane coming back. In London, the press exploded with headlines, Dam busters strike at heart of Germany. The King sent congratulations. Medals were prepared. The War Office hailed the mission as genius, proof that British ingenuity could break anything. But at Scampton, the hangars stayed quiet. Mechanics worked wordlessly through the night, washing the blood from the fuselages, scraping mud from the wheels. Barnes Wallace came to the base 2 days later. When he stepped onto the tarmac and saw the surviving aircraft, their metal scarred, their numbers fewer, he broke down. He tried to speak to Gibson, but his voice failed. Finally he managed, I never meant it to cost so much. Gibson shook his hand. It cost what it had to, he said. That's war. But his voice was flat, drained. Both men knew it wasn't a victory that could be celebrated, only endured. In the following weeks, 617 Squadron became legend. The newspapers called them heroes, the RAF called them special operations. But among themselves, the men spoke little of that night. They carried it like a secret, one too heavy to tell. Maltby, writing to his parents, said, We came back heroes, but none of us feel like it. The sound of the engines is still in my head. When I close my eyes, I see water rising. Gibson received the Victoria Cross from the King in June. He stood straight, saluted, and smiled for the photographers. But those who knew him saw the distance in his eyes. When asked later how it felt, he said only, It doesn't feel like anything. Barnes Wallis became a national symbol, the man who cracked the dams. But fame sat on him like guilt. Each interview, each speech, he repeated the same quiet line, "The men did it, not me." At night, his wife would find him awake, sitting by his desk, whispering to himself numbers only he understood. He once wrote in his diary, "They call it precision. But the closer we aim, the more we see what we're hitting." By midsummer, the Germans had begun rebuilding. New dams, thicker concrete, deeper defenses. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind silt, wreckage, and the smell of iron and death. The war ground on, indifferent to mathematics or miracles. At Scampton, replacements arrived, new faces, fresh voices, too young to remember the night of May 16. The veterans of 617 watched them train and said little. Gibson left soon after. Officially reassigned. Unofficially, spent. The squadron lined up to salute him as he boarded his car. He looked back once, eyes on the runway, and murmured, "They'll make new planes. They'll make new bombs. But they'll never make another night like that one." The engine started. The car rolled away. Behind him, the base fell quiet again. And far across the sea, in Berlin, engineers studied blueprints of new fortifications, thicker, stronger, smarter. The war was far from over. A week later, the newspapers gave them a name. The Dam Busters. Photographs filled the front pages, smiling faces, medals glinting, Guy Gibson standing tall among his men. There were parades, speeches, newsreels in crowded cinemas. For a few shining weeks, Britain had heroes again. But when the cameras left, the silence returned. June 1943. The war pressed on. The squadron that had broken the dams now found itself flying ordinary missions, raids over France, over the Channel, over cities whose names blurred into lists. The press still called them legends. The men just called them tired. Gibson was sent on a speaking tour. Cities, banquets, polite applause. He stood on stages beneath banners that read, "Triumph in the Ruhr." He shook hands, smiled for photographs, said the words the government wanted. At night, in his hotel rooms, he couldn't sleep. He wrote in his diary, in letters never sent, "I see the water again. It moves down the valley, over the roads, through the houses. I see the faces of the men who didn't come back. I don't know how to stop seeing them." The public adored him. The Air Force admired him. But behind the medals, there was something fading, that sharpness he'd once carried like a blade. The newspapers wrote of victory, of the raid that changed the war. But the truth came slower, buried in reports and numbers. By July, German engineers had rebuilt the Möhne Dam. Concrete thicker, defenses stronger. Within 6 weeks, the turbines were turning again. The Ruhr's factories roared back to life. The power grid restored. The war machine, limping, found its rhythm once more. The military analysts called the Dambuster raid a brilliant tactical success, a limited strategic effect. But the psychological shock, that was real. The idea that anything, no matter how massive, could be broken. That Germany's heart could be touched. Barnes Wallis was summoned to Whitehall to brief the air staff on future developments. They wanted more ideas, more miracles. He arrived with charts and notebooks, his hands shaking slightly. He spoke of physics, pressure waves, and new bomb shapes. But when the generals began to talk of maximum destruction, he fell silent. In his diary that night, he wrote, "They have learned only the spectacle. They do not see the cost." At Scampton, 617 Squadron carried on. The new recruits arrived with the glow of fame still fresh, they wanted to be part of the legend. The veterans said little. They had stopped telling the stories. The old Lancasters, patched and scarred, stood like ghosts in the hangars. The men moved around them carefully, as if afraid to wake the memories sleeping inside. In June, Gibson returned to the base briefly. The mess hall was different, newer faces, unfamiliar laughter. His old seat was taken. He smiled politely, offered congratulations, then excused himself early. Outside, the evening light fell across the runway, golden, quiet, endless. The sound of engines in the distance made him turn, expecting familiar voices. There were none. Only echoes. He lit a cigarette, watched the smoke drift into the summer air, and murmured, "They'll never know what it cost." The next morning, he left again. London wanted him. So did the press. The RAF made a film, The Dam Busters, they would call it later, but even the early newsreels played like fiction. The men in them looked clean, heroic, untouched. No mention of the wreckage, the fear, the flood. Somewhere in a pub in Lincolnshire, a group of ground crewmen watched one of the reels and laughed bitterly. "They make it look easy," one said. "As if we didn't bury half our friends the next day." By midsummer, the name Dam Busters had become a symbol of courage, of British ingenuity, of victory against odds. But for the men who had lived it, it became something else, a weight that could never be put down. Wallace avoided interviews. Gibson endured them. The words hero and genius followed them both like shadows. At a dinner in London, a general raised a toast to the men who proved nothing is invulnerable. The room erupted in applause. Gibson smiled thinly and lifted his glass. Later, he wrote on the back of the menu. "They believe invincibility is an illusion." Perhaps so. But so is peace. When July came, so did the fatigue. The war's pace was relentless, Italy invaded, new fronts opening. The dam raid faded from headlines to footnotes. Gibson's name remained, but his purpose blurred. He returned to flying instruction, then to operations command. Restless. Searching. The man who once commanded 19 bombers now seemed unable to command sleep. He spoke once, in a rare unguarded moment, "You can't live off one night forever. The world moves on, and you're still standing in the dark, waiting for the next flare." And somewhere inside, he knew he'd go back to the sky. He always did. The air was the only place that still made sense, clean, cold, absolute. In 1944, they would ask him again. One more mission. One more night. He would say yes. September 19, 1944. Night over Holland. Thin cloud, moonlight cutting through like paper torn by a blade. The twin Merlin engines of the Mosquito sang their soft, high note, the sound of flight and danger in equal measure. In the left seat, Wing Commander Guy Gibson checked the dials. Fuel, steady. Altitude, good. He'd flown hundreds of times, but never felt this kind of quiet. It wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that waits for something to happen. "Good luck," the controller said over the radio. Gibson replied, "Good luck," and the channel went dead. He hadn't wanted another mission. He'd promised himself the war was over for him. But the air was the only place he still belonged, clean, sharp, full of rules that made sense. Tonight, the plan was simple: lead a mosquito-marking raid over Holland, then home before dawn. Below, canals shone like veins of mercury. The navigator whispered bearings, his voice flat with focus. "Turn 5 left. Hold steady." Gibson nodded. The cockpit glowed red under the map light, like the inside of a wound. The first sign came as a cough from the starboard engine. Barely audible. He nudged the throttle. The sound evened out, but a tremor ran through the frame. They exchanged a glance, no words, just that look pilots share when they both feel something wrong. The land rose ahead. Fields, farmhouses, a church spire. The Mosquito skimmed just above it, graceful as it was fragile. The air smelled faintly of fuel. "Keep it tidy," Gibson said. Down below, in the Dutch village of Steenbergen, people were still awake, a baker at his ovens, a farmer checking the fences, a child reading by lamplight. They heard the hum, felt it in their ribs, looked up. Two faint disks of fire moved across the sky, slow and steady, heading west. Then the sound changed. A shiver in the night, a deeper tone. The plane dipped, then leveled, then dipped again, and in that moment, everyone knew. A sharp flash. No explosion, just a bloom of light and then the dark folding in again. The mosquito hit a field beyond the town. The impact was quiet, almost tender. Wood shattered, engines hissed. When villagers ran to help, the fire was already too hot. They stood in a half-circle, helpless, faces lit by orange reflection. Someone whispered, "There are two." No one moved closer. At dawn, the wreck still smoked. Soldiers took notes. The metal was twisted, the engines buried in mud. Among the debris, they found a small notebook, edges burned, but the last line still clear: "We all fly over the same water." News traveled fast. In London, telegrams. In Scampton, silence. Mechanics put down their tools. One man whispered, "The sky's taken him back." Barnes Wallis received the news alone in his office. The message said, "Aircraft lost, cause unknown." He sat for a long time, then closed his eyes. The hum of passing traffic outside sounded like distant propellers. When the notebook arrived from Holland, Wallis turned it in his hands. He read the last line only once. Then he shut it and said softly, he was right. The RAF called it an accident, engine failure, low altitude. Officially neat, emotionally unbearable. The public learned days later, Wing Commander Guy Gibson, VC, missing believed killed. In Steenbergen, locals built a small cross from orchard wood and placed it by the blackened earth. Someone left an apple. Children stood quietly, not sure why adults whispered around the ashes. Back in England, the war rolled on, another day, another mission, another sky. The name Dambuster returned to the newspapers, but now it sounded different. Not like victory, like something that had already ended. Wallis never spoke publicly about Gibson again. But in his notebooks, among equations and sketches, a single phrase appeared weeks later. "Some men reach heaven before the war ends." The war did end, eventually. The rivers were rebuilt, the skies cleared. But for those who had watched the mosquito vanish into that Dutch field, the sound of its engines never stopped. Sometimes, on quiet nights, people in Steenbergen still said they could hear it, faint, far, steady, a memory passing over the same water once more. Spring, 1946. The war had ended, but the air still smelled faintly of metal and rain. In the garden behind a quiet house in Surrey, an old man sat at a small wooden table, a cup of tea cooling beside him. On a page of scrap paper, he drew a circle, then another. Each one bounced across a sketched line of water. Barnes Wallis hadn't touched his drawing instruments in months. Yet his fingers moved with the same precision they had in the war. The pencil made a soft rhythm, impact, lift, impact again. He wasn't drawing a weapon anymore. He was drawing memory. The garden was still. A bee drifted over the lavender, a sparrow pecked at crumbs on the flagstones. Peace was supposed to sound like this, quiet, normal, survivable. But inside his head, the world was never silent. He looked up at the sky, pale blue through drifting clouds, and thought of the men who had vanished into it. 19 bombers had taken off. 8 had come home. He still remembered every call sign. Inside his house, a shelf bowed under the weight of wartime notebooks, pages filled with equations, spin ratios, drag coefficients, fuse delays. Next to them, a folder tied with string bore a single word, names. It contained the dead. He kept it close, the way others kept photographs. He opened his diary. On the top line, in careful hand, June 1946. He wrote, "The bomb was born of despair. But also of faith, in reason, in numbers, in the fragile order that lives inside chaos." He paused. Outside, a train whistle drifted faintly across the hills. Once, that sound meant departure. Now it meant routine. The world had begun again without asking his permission. Letters came every week, universities, ministries, journalists. They wanted him to lecture, to advise on new designs. His bouncing bomb had become legend. Its mathematics were already being used for underwater mapping, navigation, even weather research. The same science that had broken dams was now teaching ships to find safe harbor. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. He was proud, yes, proud of the idea, not of what it had done. He had wanted precision, not destruction. The line between them had blurred too easily. That afternoon, he walked down the lane. Children were playing in a field, tossing paper gliders that dipped and tumbled in the breeze. One boy's plane landed softly near Wallace's feet. He picked it up, studied the folds, and smiled. "You've built it well," he said. The boy grinned, unaware of who the stranger was. Wallace watched the glider sail again and thought, if only everything we built could fall so gently. Back home, he reread a letter from an old airman, one of the few still alive from the raid. The handwriting was uncertain. "We did what was asked of us. But sometimes I think the dam we broke was inside ourselves." Wallace folded the letter and set it beside his tea. He didn't answer. There were no words for that kind of truth. He knew the official histories would call it victory. They would talk about courage, engineering, the triumph of will. Few would mention the flooded valleys, the villages erased, the quiet deaths in the dark. He didn't blame them. People needed their myths. In the evening, the rain began again, a soft, steady drizzle. He listened to it strike the table, to the slow drip from the gutter. Water finding its path, patient and unending. He closed his eyes and could almost hear the roar of the dams breaking, could see the white spray rising like ghosts. He opened his diary once more and wrote. "They say there are no impossible things. Perhaps that is true. The impossible lasts only until someone believes in it." He hesitated, then added a final line, smaller, almost hidden beneath the rest. "But sometimes the most dangerous invention is faith in the human mind without limits." He laid down the pencil. The clouds parted briefly. The light softened across the garden. The air smelled of wet soil and wood smoke, the scent of a world rebuilding itself. Somewhere far off, church bells began to ring, muffled but steady. Barnes Wallace sat back, hands folded in his lap. The war was over, but its echo remained, in water, in metal, in memory. He listened, and for a moment thought he heard it again, a single splash, distant and small, the sound of something leaving the surface and never quite coming back down. The cup was empty. The page was full. The garden waited, silent.